The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring the career of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. With me is Stephan Schwartz. Stephan is a longtime parapsychology researcher, one of the founders of the International Remote Viewing Association and a few other scientific organizations as well. He is the author of The Secret Vaults of Time, the Alexandria Project, and the 8 Laws of Change. Welcome, Stephan.
A pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah.
It really is. And this is the first of a series of interviews we'll be doing. And in a way, we're going to start at the beginning of your career exploring consciousness. And it seems as if invisible forces were guiding you to connect with the Association for Research and Enlightenment, founded by Edgar Cayce.
Well, yes, that's true. I mean, I got into this area of research, which was not where my life was headed at all, back in the early 60s, because I had a series of highly unusual experiences which I could not explain. And it ended up with my going down to the ARE. I mean,
let's talk about the couple who found you at this remote farmhouse where you lived.
I got drafted in the very early 60s. I was working for National Geographic, and I got drafted and had to go into the Army. This was during the Vietnam period. And I came out, and I wrote a movie for Colonial Williamsburg. And I sent a copy of the script to a chap that I had met in the Army who had gone to New York Film School, who was then working for Screen Gems. And he showed it to him, and they asked me to come up to New York. And so I was terribly excited. You know, I was about 23 years old, and I had this job in New York as a screenwriter, and I bought this lovely little Mercedes 190 SL convertible. And so I thought everything was just very cool. And I got to know a lot of people. I met Andy Warhol and Truman Capote. And I went to a party that Truman Capote gave. And as I went to the bathroom, and as I was coming back down the hall, I looked in a mirror. There was this antique Italian gilt mirror on the wall. And suddenly, spontaneously, looking at myself in the mirror, I said, "You are becoming an unattractive person."
You're getting caught up in a materialistic lifestyle.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
And I said it to myself, and I thought, my God, that's right. Something is wrong. And I couldn't figure out what it was, because I was doing all the things you were supposed to do. I was being successful at it. You know, I mean, I was making money, and I knew all these famous people.
Right. Unusual for a person so young.
Yeah. And so I left the party. It was on Fire Island. And I walked down slept on the beach, and got up the next morning and got in my little car and drove back to my family's farm in Virginia, which is very rural, part of Tidewater, Virginia, Gloucester County. Yeah. And I was in an existential crisis because all of the things that I thought were important and my views about the world all suddenly were called into question. And I didn't know what to replace it with. I didn't have anything, all the things that the culture tells you is what you should be doing, I was doing, and it wasn't working. I wasn't satisfied.
Fair to say you didn't really, at that point in your life, have a spiritual foundation.
None whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up and actually quite thankful to my parents, in an utterly non-religious family.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that they were against religion, they just weren't interested in it. And so I had absolutely no religious background at all in anything. And I was sitting on the porch of my family's house. This was an old land grant house from colonial Virginia, way down a school bus road, 10 miles, and our lane was a mile long. And so it's not an easy place to get to. And I was sitting there really completely in despair. And I looked up, and walking in my mother's gardens was this middle-aged couple. And he was dressed in a beautiful, bespoke, double-breasted gray suit, and she had on this lovely linen dress. They looked like people that should be in Manhattan on Park Avenue, not people that were out in the country in Virginia. And I looked over where the cars parked, no car. I looked down at the water. We had a dock, no boat. Well, how did they get here? I mean, who are these people? Where did they come from?
Yeah.
And they saw me looking at them, and they came over and came up to the porch. It was a big, long screen porch looking out over the water. And I opened the door, and they came in, and this woman looked at me for a long beat and said, "Do you believe in reincarnation?" The first words out of her mouth. And not hello, is her introduction, or, do you believe in reincarnation? I was just dumbfounded, and I thought about it for a second or for a little while, and I said, well, I think I probably do. It seems very symmetrical. And she said, would you like to meet Thomas Jefferson? And I'd gone to University of Virginia, and which he founded, Mr. Jefferson founded. And I said, well, is he back? And she said, yeah. And then I said, wait. Who are you and how did you get here? Because they didn't look like crazy people at all. I mean, so they introduced themselves as Ed and Paula Fitzgerald. And I looked at this guy, and he looked kind of familiar. And I realized that I had seen him at a film conference in New York. And I said to him, are you Ed Fitzgerald, the production designer? Did you just do Magnificent Seven? And he said, yes. So that gave them a kind of gravitas that made everything that was beginning to seem very crazy a little less crazy. And she said to me, I said, how did you get here? Why are you here? And she said, I had a dream that told me to come up. And I said, you had a dream, but I mean, this is not an easy place to get to. How did you know where to turn? And she said, well, when I woke up, I just wrote all the turns down, and I could see the things in my mind, and we just drove it. We're here.
Amazing that she trusted her dreams. So much.
that she trusted her dreams. And she said, do you know who Edgar Cayce is? I said, no. And she said, well, he's this man who does this psychic thing or did this.
Not far away in Virginia.
Yeah, not in Virginia Beach. And I said, well, I don't know anything about it, and I don't know anything about that. That's the whole area. I'd never had any particular interest in it. And she said, well, I'd like to invite you down for the weekend. And just then, this green Ford station wagon came down, and there was another young couple in it. And she said, give me your telephone number. So I gave her my telephone number. And she got in the car and drove away. And I was left there sitting, thinking to myself, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
I mean, it just didn't fit anything that I was familiar with. So about a week later, I got a call, and it was a guy, and he said, this is T.J. Davis, Thomas Jefferson Davis, his name. And I'd like to invite you down for the weekend. So they gave me instructions of how to do that. And I drove down, and I got to the address, there was a young man up on a ladder, and they were building some kind of leather, what turned out to be a leather shop. And I said, I'm looking for T.J. Davis. And, oh, he's not here, but Joan is. And around the corner came this really quite beautiful woman with these beautiful lavender eyes. And she said to me, oh, yes, you must be Stephen, and I will take you up to the ARE. And I said, what's the ARE? Oh, that's the organization that studies Edgar Cayce. And I thought, okay. So I got in the car and we drove up, and she took me into what was the old hospital building. Mm-hmm. Edgar Cayce had a hospital in Virginia Beach, and he's really the father of holistic medicine. And I walked into the room, and there was one whole end of it was filled with these green, looked like school book spiral 3-ring binders. Mm-hmm. And she said, those are the readings, and explained to me what she thought a reading was. And just at random, I just was walking along. I pulled one off a shelf and opened it up. And it was a reading given in 1936 for a woman, and it said that she had been a member of the Essene community, and they gave a description of where it was, and I recognized it as Khirbet Qumran, and that she had been a teacher of astrology.
Because you had studied the Dead Sea Scrolls in some prior work you had done.
Yeah. So before I got drafted, before I left to go into the Army, the last thing I had done for the National Geographic was to do a lot of research on the Dead Sea Scrolls for an article they were preparing.
You had been an employee at the National Geographic.
I was a researcher writer for Geographic. Mm-hmm. And so I had done all this research, and it was a subject I knew about. And I knew that in 1936, nobody knew that Khirbet Qumran was an Essene community. It was generally thought to have been an outpost of the Emperor Vespasian's legions, built during the Jewish uprising. And in general, the Essenes were thought to be a schismatic order of Jewish monks. Josephus describes them in that way. So nobody knew women were involved. And the whole astrology thing, nobody knew anything about that. But then in 1947, 11 years later, a young Bedouin tribes boy had been chucking rocks in a cave, and he struck what turned out to be one of the urns holding the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yep. And that's how we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when they discovered them, as they translated them and opened them up, they realized that they were obsessed with astrology. And when they did excavation at the site, they discovered female skeletons, so they realized there were women present. It wasn't
just the community of male monks, as I believe Josephus had written.
Yeah, exactly. And so they basically everything he said in 1936 was correct.
So, and many people don't, even in the parapsychology community, don't appreciate that kind of detail in Edgar Cayce's readings.
Well, that's true. For cultural reasons, I think, and some historical issues, parapsychology has never paid any attention to Edgar Cayce, which is unfortunate because his 15,000, not quite 15,000, but 14,783.
And you're one of the only people who's actually read them all.
Yes.
His readings.
Yes. And so I said to this young woman, let me take you to dinner. I have some questions. Because I was stunned. As I read this thing, I thought, well, he knew this 11 years before it was discovered by archaeology. So where was the information? And how did he access it? Where do you get information like that? So I took her to dinner, and as we were going through dinner, I realized that there was something important here, and that I didn't understand it.
And some of our viewers may not know Edgar Cayce went into a trance state.
Yes. Okay, let me say something about that. So I called back to the farm and said, this is going to take a little longer than a weekend. It actually took 5 years. Mm-hmm. And the next day, I decided I would read all the readings.
You had money. You didn't have to work. You could devote 5 years to an intensive study, going through every single one of Edgar Cayce's readings.
Exactly.
And on top of that, the parapsychology library that they had.
Yes. So I set about very systematically reading all of the readings. And in those days, the ARE was a little tiny organization of about 1,800 people.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that were at Virginia Beach at the old hospital were mostly elderly people who had known Edgar Cayce when he has been alive. He died in 1946.
Mm-hmm.
So Gladys Davis Turner, Gladys Davis, as she's usually known, who was Edgar Cayce's lifelong secretary and who continued the work after he died,
Mm-hmm.
and Hugh Lynn Cayce, his eldest son. I got to be very friendly with both of them, and I interviewed all of these people who had known him and who said, no, he was completely legit. I mean, this was not some kind of scam. Yeah. And so I interviewed. I
don't believe anyone has ever questioned his sincerity.
Yes, well, I did.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to know why he went into trance. Anyway, I got really interested in this.
Mm-hmm.
I had never encountered anything like that. So I set out to read all the readings. And after about 2 years of doing that, literally 12 hours a day,
mm-hmm. Sitting in the library, I thought, well, I need to read the parapsychological literature to understand how this fits into this other material, the scholarly research. And so I started reading all of the parapsychological literature. And everything that the ARE had and everything Old Dominion University had and everything William and Mary had, mm-hmm.
because those were close enough to me that I could
all
go
good
there.
libraries.
All good libraries,
mm-hmm.
and I could go there. And
so you completely, at a young age, immersed yourself
yes.
in all of this literature.
Yes.
That was essentially the beginning of your career.
Yes, and
mm-hmm.
and as a result of that, by the time I became an experimentalist in 1968, I didn't, and I think this has really a critical part of my career,
mm-hmm.
is I didn't come at this from is this stuff real? I was already convinced that
mm-hmm.
there was a legitimate phenomena here.
Convinced because you were familiar with the literature.
Because I was familiar both with the academic literature. I mean, I literally
mm-hmm.
read all of the journals, mm-hmm. the books, people that are forgotten now.
Yeah. Well, this is an important point because I didn't say by virtue of introducing you that you have probably done more successful applied sci projects, especially in archaeology, than any other person who has ever lived.
Yeah, that's probably true, actually.
And
it's because
mm-hmm.
I began from the perspective. I started from an anthropological point of view. Yeah. My issue was not, is it real? My issue was, can you do anything with it?
Mm-hmm.
And how does it work? That's what I cared about. So my experimental interests from the very beginning were not proving that what I then called distant viewing, this is 1968, was real. I knew that it was real because Gladys had meticulously documented hundreds and thousands
mm-hmm.
of cases where Cayce had said things which today we would call outbound remote viewing that proved to be exactly accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And there's thousands of these examples. And so I had read all these things and I had seen the documentation that they were correct. So here's a man who's sitting either in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, or in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and he's talking about people. And in some cases, for instance, in one particular case that I remember, he gave a reading in a dialect of Italian. And he didn't speak Italian. He had an 8th grade education, post-Civil War, rural Southern education. And he's giving this reading in not just Italian, but a dialect of Italian. And they couldn't understand it. They had to go out, and Hugh Lynn went out and found a fruit vendor who came from, it was Genovese, I think,
mm-hmm.
and who could translate it. It was for a woman in Italy.
Oh.
And he gave the reading in the dialect of her region. So, I mean, there were mm-hmm. these kinds of cases. There were stories where he would say, go to this drugstore, and on the 3rd shelf, in the back of the shelf, you'll find this bottle, and it's got this particular label. And they would notify the pharmacist, and he would say, or he said, I don't have anything like that. And they said, well, go back and look.
Mm-hmm.
And so he came back on the phone and said, well, I don't know where this came from, but that was exactly right. There's this bottle smoke oil that's the company doesn't exist anymore, and it must have been back there for years, but it was exactly where he said it was. Mm-hmm. So that kind of thing. So
now I know you also found examples where he was inaccurate.
Oh yes, absolutely. And that
like
was
100%. Like
no, nobody's 100%.
Yeah.
What that taught me, I learned a lot from studying the Cayce material, and also from studying it in the context of the academic parapsychological stuff. Because I realized, Cayce says very explicitly, and this of course is true, that the questioner is as much a player as the person who is being the remote viewer. Mm-hmm. That the attitudes and expectations of the experimenter have an effect on the outcome of the experiment.
In other words, it's a system. All the people involved in the system are contributing to it in one way or another.
Yes, exactly.
So the psychic functioning, when it occurs, is like a social phenomenon.
Yes, I actually think of it as a biocircuit. Mm-hmm. That there is a linkage that occurs at the non-local level in which we bring to it our attitudes, our expectations, and our intentions. Mm-hmm. And so by reading the Cayce readings and these documents, I had come to understand about this. I mean, he says it explicitly that the attitudes and expectations of the questioner make a difference. And there are two major areas where I think the Cayce material just doesn't hold up. One is his Egyptian history, and the other is Atlantis. Mm-hmm. And I say that as one of the people who wrote the first articles in modern times about Atlantis, because I was part of what became known as the Marine Archaeological Research Society that was founded by Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame. And when her son, who was a pilot, was flying over Bimini, where Cayce places Atlantis, and saw a building under the water. Yeah. And we then went out and found the building, and the media thought it was an Atlantean temple. It turns out it's a turtle pen. And then we found the Bimini Road. Mm-hmm. And Peter Tompkins, who wrote Secret Life of Plants and a lot of other things, Peter and I got the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey laboratories we took them a part of the road and had them analyze it. It's normal beach rock. It just looks like it's paving, but they're just so.
A red herring all the way.
Yes. And so I thought, well, why is he wrong about these two areas? And then I went back because of the careful documentation, I went back into who had actually asked these questions. And these were people who were passionately committed.
They had what you would call a cherished outcome.
Yes, they had a cherished outcome, and they were true believers. Uh-huh. And I realized at that point, and have now demonstrated this experimentally, that in the non-local domain, a thing which is deeply believed by people is, in fact, as real as an actual thing. Mm-hmm. That's where the archetypal idea. Yeah. I mean, we know from, for instance, in remote viewing research, that if I were to give you an experiment in which one of the figures was your grandmother, that even though you don't know what the target, it's in a sealed thing or it hasn't even been selected yet, but your grandmother's part of the target set, that there is a significant probability that you will displace and describe your grandmother. You'll be drawn to that target.
I'll be drawn to it, yeah.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Because things which are strongly held and believed have a reality in the non-local domain that is actually equivalent to the actual information. Yeah. It's sort of like taking a steaming tea kettle into a London fog. It's pretty hard to tell which is the tea kettle steam and which is the fog. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what happened.
So, sure, psychic work is not easy.
No, it's not easy. And once you get past the idea that, can it be real? And you start looking at it as a phenomena. I saw it as an engineering problem. Yeah. I mean, I got into experimental work first in '68, I in my back garden, I went to a ship chandler and bought a yellow line, and I laid out a grid of 144 foot square, 12 by 12 grid, and I photocopied the grid, and each week I would go and I got a post hole digger, and I would dig a hole, and I would put in I started with little film canisters, and then I got to quart.
You were burying objects in the garden,
and
mapped out by the grid. And then you'd show people a photocopy and ask them to find the object and describe it.
That's right. So, from my point of view, anybody that was interested, I was interested to see how broadly this skill was distributed and I became clear that it's distributed like any human skill, whether it's violin playing or tennis playing or golfing. There's a few people that are really, really good at it. There's a few people that are really, really bad at it, but most of us fall somewhere in the middle. And that's what that's what taught me that. So I each week for about...
This is like your first experiment.
These were my first experiments. For about a year, every week, so that's like 52 of them, I would bury in one of the grids. And the reason 144 was, 1 in 20. And so, 1 in 144. And I would ask people...
You could do a statistical analysis.
Exactly. Yeah. And I would give them a sheet of this grid on a piece of paper, and I would say, first of all, would you please go over this grid? And sometimes there was nothing there, sometimes there were things there. And I would say, if you believe the target that I would like you to discover is in this grid, would you please mark the grid that you think it's at? And if you think it's there, would you please describe for me what it would be? And it would be things like Barbie dolls in the jar, or scissors, or ink blotter, or an orange. And so all kinds of things, because I was trying to see were some things easier to see than other things, and could some people do it. And what I discovered was a small percentage of people, if I were guessing, I would say about 12% were pretty good at it and could do it. And there was another small little group, a little smaller, who just could never do it, never seemed to be able to give themselves permission to do it. And I got interested in why that was true. So when I began to do experimentation, my interest, as I say, was not, is it real, but...
You never doubted it was real because you had immersed yourself for 5 years in the literature itself.
Before I did anything.
And that's something that most researchers, I have to say, don't do.
No, I mean...
Most researchers are not as familiar with the literature, let alone having read every single Edgar Cayce reading.
Well, every reading and essentially everything that had been published in parapsychology. I mean, I started with the beginning of Jasper and the beginning of the JP and
the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research and the Journal of Parapsychology.
And the Society for Psychical Research in London.
The proceedings that go back to 1882.
Yeah. And, they were in the library. Nobody read them. I'd get these old, crumbly journals out. This was when they were still, it was pre-computers, and that's what I did, 12 hours a day.
So the number one lesson, if I were a young person interested in going into the field, I would say the lesson that you could offer is immerse themselves in the literature first and foremost.
Yes.
Stephen, our time is up.
Oh, okay.
It goes quickly when you're having fun. This has been a delight. I know we're going to have a number of other interesting conversations on related topics. Thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.